My name is Eleanor. I am 58 years old, and just 4 nights ago at my own son's wedding, my life was ripped open in ways I could never have imagined. The air was thick with champagne laughter, the clinking of glasses, the rhythm of the band striking chords of celebration, and yet in the middle of all that glitter and joy, I felt a storm brewing deep inside me. I remember the scent of roses threaded into the arch where the vows were spoken, the silk of my dress brushing against my legs as I tried to keep myself composed, and the heat of my husband's hand tightening around mine. Then, as the couple twirled for their first dance and everyone's eyes glistened with tears of joy, my husband leaned close to my ear. His voice was a trembling whisper, jagged with urgency and fear. "He doesn't love you anymore." I froze. For a moment I thought he was speaking nonsense brought on by wine or nerves, but his tone wasn't drunk, and his hand clutched mine like he was keeping me upright, as if he knew I might collapse under the weight of what he was about to say. My heart drummed violently in my chest, thudding so hard I feared the people around me would hear. I turned my head to search his eyes for an explanation, but all I saw was sorrow, a shadowy truth he was dragging from somewhere deep. The music swelled around us, violins pulling everyone else into bliss, while my ears roared with a storm. I asked him what he meant, my lips barely moving, my breath caught in my throat. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his gaze dropped to the floor, and in that instant I knew this wasn't some passing comment. It was a revelation that would rip my soul apart. The wedding lights blurred in my vision. My son Oliver looked so radiant as he twirled his bride, his smile stretching wider than I had ever seen. I had raised him, held him when he was sick, tucked him into bed night after night, and here he was, beginning a new chapter. I should have been basking in joy, soaking in the proud glow of motherhood, but instead, my husband's whisper pulsed like poison through my veins. "He doesn't love you anymore." Who? My son? My husband? Both? The words didn't make sense, but they shredded the fragile peace I had wrapped around myself for this day. I tried to keep my composure, to smile when guests passed by, but my knees wobbled beneath me, and I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. I could taste salt at the edge of my lips, though I hadn't realized tears had started falling. In a desperate attempt to shake off the unease, I forced my mind to wander back, to recall the moments leading up to this day, the family dinners, the long evenings of planning the wedding, the lists scribbled in my son's handwriting. But then another memory surged, a conversation weeks earlier when Oliver had avoided my gaze as I asked him about something as simple as seating arrangements. His reply had been sharp, impatient, colder than I had ever heard. Back then, I told myself it was stress. Now I wondered if it had been the beginning of something far worse. The music faded for a brief interlude, and in that quiet I heard whispers not from my husband this time, but from behind me, guests murmuring, something hushed, urgent, a thread of gossip threading through the air. My skin prickled. I turned and saw two women clutching their champagne glasses, leaning into each other, one of them glancing toward me, then quickly away when our eyes met. A tremor slid down my spine. What did they know? What had already slipped into the open while I remained in the dark? I grabbed my husband's sleeve, pulling him closer, my voice a quiver of desperation. "Tell me what you mean," I begged, my throat tight. He only shook his head, lips pressed into a thin line, his face pale, and whispered again, "Not here, not now." And yet those words were not enough to soothe me. They were gasoline poured onto my fear. If not now, when? If not here, why at all? Why tell me anything in the middle of our son's wedding, unless the truth was so urgent it couldn't wait? My hands trembled. The world spun. The laughter around me sounded distorted, like broken glass scattering across a floor. I pressed a hand against my chest, trying to calm the storm raging inside, but every beat of my heart seemed to scream louder. I could see Oliver glance at me briefly from across the dance floor. His eyes landed on mine, and instead of warmth, I caught something that froze my blood. It wasn't love. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else, something hard, something calculating. I blinked, and he was smiling again, turning his bride, charming the crowd, but the image of that fleeting glance carved itself into my soul like a knife. My husband squeezed my hand again, harder this time, his eyes pleading with me to keep quiet, to hold myself together, but my chest tightened, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't yet ask. Was it about Oliver? About his new wife? About us? What betrayal was about to unfold in the very place I should have been celebrating? The night carried on with toasts and cheers, but I felt myself unraveling inside. Each word spoken by others sounded muffled, distant, while the whisper of my husband's voice echoed louder and louder in my mind. My throat burned. I reached for a glass of water, but even the cool liquid did nothing to calm the fire inside me. My fingers clung to the stem of the glass, as though it was the only thing tethering me to reality. As the evening drew deeper, I realized I couldn't escape the dread swelling in my chest. My husband's silence was heavier than any truth he could have spoken aloud. I tried to follow the dance of candlelight across the tables, tried to lose myself in the rhythm of music, but my body was alert, coiled, waiting. And then, when I thought perhaps I could make it through the night without breaking, I heard the sound that shattered me all over again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing on the wooden floor of the hall. I turned my head, and there was Oliver, his face shadowed now, his eyes unreadable. He was walking toward me, each step measured, heavy with something unsaid. My breath caught. My heart stopped. My husband's whisper replayed in my skull louder than ever. "He doesn't love you anymore." And as Oliver came closer, I realized those words were not a warning about the past. They were a prophecy of what was about to happen. Before everything fell apart, before whispers of betrayal began haunting me at night, life in our home felt like a sanctuary. I often woke before sunrise, the world still wrapped in its quiet hush, and the first thing I did each morning was brew coffee. The sound of beans grinding filled the kitchen, while the faint orange glow of dawn spilled across the curtains. I'd stand there barefoot on the cool tiled floor, holding the warm mug in my hands, inhaling the bitter steam that always seemed to settle my nerves. Outside, the sparrows chattered in the branches of the maple tree Henry had planted the year we married, and the air smelled of dew and grass. That was my rhythm. A simple peace that wrapped itself around my days, long before I knew how fragile that peace really was. Henry would shuffle in next, his slippers dragging across the floor, his eyes half closed, but his lips curling into that familiar crooked smile. "Smells like heaven," he'd say, wrapping his arms around my waist, pressing his stubbled cheek against my neck. I'd laugh, pretending to swat him away, but really those moments were what made the mornings glow. Soon after, Oliver would wander in, lanky and yawning, followed by his younger brother Samuel, who always carried a joke on his tongue. Our kitchen would swell with chatter, the clinking of spoons in cereal bowls, the slam of the refrigerator door, and sometimes the playful bickering of two boys who seemed as different as day and night. Back then, I thought we had everything a family could need. A modest house painted cream, sunlight streaming across wooden floors. Henry had sanded himself, walls lined with framed photos, birthdays, graduations, family trips. On Sundays after church, we gathered around the old oak table Henry had carved in his workshop when I was pregnant with Oliver. Its surface was worn smooth by years of meals, board games, and the press of elbows during late-night talks. I can still hear the sound of Samuel's laughter bouncing off those walls, mingling with Henry's deep chuckles, while Oliver sat more reserved, though still with a quiet smile that warmed me in its own way. Our lives weren't glamorous, but they were woven with threads of comfort and belonging. We'd host barbecues in the backyard, where neighbors spilled in with potato salad and lemonade, and Henry stood at the grill with a spatula like a king guarding his throne. On summer evenings, the boys chased fireflies until their faces glistened with sweat, and I'd sit on the porch, sipping iced tea, thinking life couldn't be more perfect. Winter meant nights huddled by the fireplace, Samuel sprawled on the rug with his comic books, Oliver reading in the corner, Henry whittling something from wood, and me knitting with yarn that always tangled in my lap. Those nights felt eternal, like the world outside couldn't touch us. I remember one autumn especially, when the air smelled of apples and wood smoke, and we drove out to the countryside. The trees flamed gold and crimson, and the boys ran ahead through the orchard, their laughter carried by the wind. Henry reached for my hand, squeezing it as he whispered, "We did good, Ellie. Look at them. We did good." My heart swelled with pride, my chest aching with love so fierce it almost frightened me. It's strange how those moments, so ordinary, so small, now feel like fragile glass I want to clutch in my hands, though shards of truth have already cut me deep. But even in those days of warmth, I sometimes noticed cracks I chose to ignore. Oliver was quieter than Samuel, more serious, his eyes darker, his thoughts harder to read. Samuel burst with affection, hugging me without reason, teasing his father, singing off-key to the radio. Oliver, on the other hand, often lingered on the edges, watching, his expression unreadable. At times I convinced myself he was just introspective, a boy lost in his books and ambitions, but sometimes, when laughter filled the room, I'd catch him staring, his jaw clenched, as if he were on the outside of it all, as if joy was something he couldn't quite touch. I brushed it aside. Mothers always worry, don't they? I told myself Oliver loved differently, more quietly, that his heart was still tethered to us, even if he didn't wear it openly on his sleeve like Samuel. I smoothed over those uneasy thoughts with routines, pancakes sizzling on Saturday mornings, the creak of the swing set Henry built, the hum of crickets at night. I didn't want to believe that shadows could creep into the heart of a home so filled with light. Holidays were always my favorite. The smell of pine filling the house at Christmas, stockings stretched along the mantel, and the sound of carols spinning from the old record player. I can still see Oliver stringing lights with Henry, carefully, precisely, while Samuel draped tinsel around his neck like a clown, making us roar with laughter. Those days, I thought we were untouchable. Family was everything. Family was forever. But family is fragile. That truth hides itself in small details. A tone of voice, a glance across the table, a silence that lingers too long. I didn't know then that the smiles we shared at the oak table could someday turn into sharp knives in the dark. I didn't know that the son I nursed in my arms would one day look at me with eyes colder than the grave. If I had known, perhaps I would have held Samuel tighter, kissed Henry longer, watched Oliver more closely when the flicker of something strange passed through his gaze. Still, in those days, love covered everything. At night, when the boys had gone to bed and the house had gone still, Henry and I would lie side by side in the quiet. He'd brush a strand of hair from my face and whisper, "No matter what, we'll always have each other." I believed him. I believed in us, in our children, in the promise of family. That belief was the very foundation of my life. And yet, if I close my eyes now, I can see that even back then, shadows were creeping closer. I remember once, during a family dinner, Oliver's fork clattered too hard against his plate when Samuel joked about who would inherit Henry's tools someday. Oliver's jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and though he said nothing, I felt a chill. Just a moment, just a flicker. But enough that my stomach knotted. I told myself I was imagining it, that brothers squabbled, that it was nothing. But sometimes the smallest flicker is the start of a fire that devours everything. And as I look back now, I know those perfect days were already slipping away, cracks widening silently beneath our feet. I didn't see them then, or maybe I didn't want to. Because even in the middle of all that peace, deep in Oliver's eyes, something unspoken was waiting to surface, something that would one day shatter me in ways I could never repair. Oliver and Samuel could not have been more different, and though I loved them both with all that I had, the contrast between my sons often felt like the shifting of light and shadow in our home. Samuel was laughter. He walked into a room and the air seemed to lift. He would throw his arm around my shoulders, tease Henry until his father pretended to be gruff, and burst into song while washing the dishes. His smile was effortless, wide and unguarded, the kind of smile that made people want to stay near him. Oliver, though, was silence. His steps were deliberate, his eyes sharp, his voice steady but cold. He rarely joined in Samuel's antics, choosing instead to retreat into the quiet of his books or the rigid order of his own plans. As boys, Samuel built forts out of blankets, inviting neighborhood kids in for battles of imagination, while Oliver sat apart, sketching diagrams of machines or balancing checkbooks he made from scraps of paper. Even as a child, Oliver seemed older than his years, carrying a seriousness in his bones that made me wonder if he ever truly felt the freedom of play. Samuel teased him, calling him the old man, but Oliver never laughed. He only stared, his lips pressed thin, as though he were keeping score of every slight, every joke that set him apart. I saw the divide grow as they entered their teenage years. Samuel fell in love with music, his guitar forever slung across his shoulder, strumming melodies that drifted through the house on summer evenings. Oliver scoffed at him, muttering that music wouldn't pay bills, that dreams were a waste of time. I'd catch them at the kitchen table, Samuel humming while doing homework, Oliver snapping. "Could you stop making noise for once?" The silence that followed always felt heavier than it should have, and I found myself smoothing over their quarrels, offering cookies, changing the subject, anything to keep the storm at bay. But storms don't vanish because you ignore them. They gather, they brew, and Oliver's silence became sharper, edged with something bitter I couldn't quite name. His questions about money grew more frequent as he aged. How much does Dad make? What's in the savings account? Who gets the house when you're gone? They were questions spoken flatly, almost innocently, yet every time they cut me. I tried to laugh them off, telling him we were a family, that love meant more than numbers, but I could see the way his eyes flickered when Samuel laughed too loudly, or when Henry praised Samuel for his kindness. It was as if every bit of affection his brother received was stolen from him, and he was determined to tally the loss. One evening I found Oliver in Henry's study, rifling through drawers. His excuse was that he needed a pen, but the way his hand froze over the stack of old bank statements told me otherwise. "Oliver," I said, my voice firm but not unkind, "your father's things are not for snooping." He looked up at me, his jaw tight, and said, "Maybe they should be. Maybe someone needs to know what's really going on here." The words startled me, not because of what he said, but because of how he said them, with a bitterness that didn't belong to a son speaking to his mother. Samuel, on the other hand, never cared for money or plans. He spent his weekends volunteering at the community shelter, playing guitar for children, fixing old bikes for kids who couldn't afford them. "He's wasting his time," Oliver muttered once, when Samuel left the house with a bag of canned goods to donate. "What does he get out of it? Nothing, just a fool handing away everything." I tried to defend Samuel, telling Oliver that generosity was its own reward, but he only shook his head and turned away, his lips curling in a way that chilled me. The more Samuel's warmth shone, the more Oliver seemed to retreat into coldness. He rarely smiled in family photos anymore. He stopped joining us on game nights, stopped laughing at Henry's corny jokes. I remember watching him one Christmas, standing in the corner while Samuel played guitar and led us all in carols. Oliver's eyes didn't shine with joy, they burned with something else, something I recognized only later as resentment. And yet, despite the unease that sometimes fluttered in my chest, I told myself Oliver loved us. He was simply different, more serious, more guarded. That's what mothers do. We rationalize, we soften, we tell ourselves our children are fine, but deep down, I sensed something dangerous in the widening gulf between my boys. Samuel's openness seemed to irritate Oliver, as though his brother's happiness was a spotlight exposing Oliver's own shadows. As they grew older, arguments between them sharpened. Samuel teased playfully, but Oliver no longer took it lightly. He snapped back with words that cut deep, insults wrapped in calm tones that left Samuel blinking in surprise. I tried to intervene, but Oliver always looked at me with those piercing eyes, as if daring me to take sides. I never wanted to choose. They were both my sons, both pieces of my heart, and yet it was becoming harder to deny that Oliver carried a darkness Samuel did not. The first time I truly felt afraid was during a late-night quarrel in the living room. Samuel had just announced he wanted to study music instead of business, and Oliver laughed bitterly. "So you'll be poor your whole life and expect Mom and Dad to bail you out? Figures." Samuel flushed with anger, his fists clenched, but instead of striking his brother, he simply said, "At least I'll be happy, Oliver. You should try that sometime." The words hung in the air, sharp as knives, and Oliver's eyes, oh, his eyes, went cold and flat, like stone. He didn't reply. He just stared at Samuel with a hatred that made my skin crawl. That night, lying in bed beside Henry, I whispered, "Do you think Oliver resents us? Resents Samuel?" Henry sighed, his hand resting heavy on my shoulder, and said, "He's just different. He'll find his way." But I wasn't so sure. My heart told me something darker was taking root, a shadow growing too fast, too quietly. I think of those days now with a mixture of sorrow and dread. The signs were all there, the questions about money, the silences that stretched too long, the eyes that watched too closely. A storm was brewing, and though I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than the ordinary struggles of siblings deep inside, I knew better. And on nights when the house grew still and I was left alone with my thoughts, I sometimes felt that storm pressing against the walls, waiting for the day it would finally break. It began subtly, so subtly that if I had not been a mother, I might have missed it altogether. Oliver's tone when he spoke to Henry shifted from respectful to sharp, his words clipped like little knives hidden in casual sentences. He started staying up late, poring over documents at the dining table, papers I hadn't seen before, thick envelopes that arrived in the mail addressed not to him, but to us. At first I thought it was curiosity, maybe even ambition, but soon I realized Oliver wasn't simply reading, he was studying, he was memorizing, he was preparing. Henry noticed it too. One evening I found him staring through the half-open door of the study, his face shadowed with worry. When I asked what was wrong, he whispered, "I don't like the way Oliver's been acting. It's not just teenage moodiness anymore." His hand tightened on the doorknob as he added, "He's looking for control. I can feel it." The fear in his voice unsettled me. My husband, who had always been steady, who had always defended his children no matter what, was finally admitting something had changed. Then came the conversations that unsettled me most. Oliver asking about the house, about the land Henry had inherited from his father, about the small business accounts we had quietly saved over the years. "It's important to know these things," he'd argue when I questioned him. "What if something happens to you? Shouldn't I be prepared?" His eyes locked on mine when he said it, daring me to challenge him. I tried to brush it aside, tried to tell myself it was responsibility, that he only wanted to help, but deep inside a chill ran through me. There was no warmth in his questions, only calculation. It didn't help when he married Clara. From the moment she entered our lives, I felt an unease I couldn't quite name. She was polite enough, smiling and thanking me for meals, complimenting Henry's carpentry. But her eyes were restless, always flicking from one corner of the room to another, measuring, weighing, as though our home were something to be assessed and claimed. When she thought no one was watching, I caught her gaze lingering on the photographs that lined our mantel, her lips pressed in a thin line. Together, Oliver and Clara formed a fortress. They whispered in corners, they exchanged glances across the dinner table, and slowly they began to separate themselves from us. Samuel felt it too. He joked less when they were around, his easy laughter shrinking into awkward silence. One night, after they had left, he muttered under his breath, "I don't trust them, Mom. I don't like the way they look at you and Dad." His words echoed Henry's, and though I hushed him, telling him not to create division, my heart secretly agreed. There were evenings when Henry and I sat at the oak table long after everyone had gone to bed, the only light coming from the lamp above us. He would lean close and whisper, "Ellie, I think Oliver's planning something." His words felt heavy, too heavy to speak aloud. I asked what he meant, and Henry only shook his head, running a hand through his thinning hair. "He's pushing too much about wills, about inheritance, about who gets what when we're gone. He's not waiting for us to live out our lives. He wants control now." The more Henry spoke, the more I noticed it too. Oliver had begun bringing forms with him, legal documents, estate planning guides, even contracts. He'd slide them across the table, his tone cool and persuasive. "It's just smart to get these things in order," he'd say. "You don't want the government deciding what happens when you're gone, do you?" His words dripped with logic, but behind them I felt a hunger I didn't want to name. Henry would push the papers back, his jaw tight, "We're not ready for this conversation," he'd reply, and Oliver's eyes would darken like storm clouds. Clara fed the fire. She'd smile sweetly, her voice soft as silk, and yet her suggestions sliced deeper than Oliver's. "You should think about making Oliver executor," she murmured once, while we sat on the porch. "He's the responsible one. Samuel's too carefree, don't you think?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes drilled into mine, daring me to disagree. I forced a laugh, saying both my sons were capable, but her smile never reached her eyes. I began to dread family gatherings. Meals that once bubbled with laughter now sat heavy with tension. Samuel tried to keep the peace, cracking jokes, asking questions, but Oliver's responses grew colder, his smile thinner. He rarely looked at me anymore, and when he did, it was as though he were searching for weakness, as though he already knew a truth I hadn't yet discovered. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner, Henry pulled me aside in the kitchen. His face was pale, his voice low. "I don't trust him anymore," he said, his eyes glistening with something close to grief. "Our own son. I don't know what happened to him, Ellie, but he's not the boy we raised." His words pierced me like arrows. To hear Henry, who had always defended Oliver, who had always brushed away my worries, finally admit he was afraid, it shook me to my core. I wanted to believe Oliver still loved us. I wanted to believe that beneath the cold questions and the strange silences, our son was still there. But each passing week it grew harder to cling to that hope. The way he lingered over documents, the way Clara's hand always found his, a silent pact between them. The way Samuel's presence seemed to ignite a bitterness Oliver could no longer hide. And then came the night. Henry showed me a piece of paper he had found tucked beneath a stack of bills in the study. It wasn't ours. It was typed, cold, clinical. At the top were the words "Power of Attorney." My hands trembled as I read it, the ink blurring through my tears. Someone had already filled in Oliver's name. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. Henry whispered, "He sits trying to take everything, Ellie. Not later, now." The truth pressed down on me, like a weight I could not escape. The storm I had felt brewing for years was no longer distant. It was here, and it was being driven by the very son I had cradled in my arms, the boy I had once sung to sleep. That night, lying awake beside Henry, I couldn't shake the image of Oliver's eyes, cold, determined, relentless. For the first time, I admitted to myself something I had been too afraid to believe. Our son was no longer simply distant. He was dangerous. Henry had always been a man of steady silence, the kind of husband who kept secrets only when they were harmless. Surprises for birthdays, the purchase of a necklace he would give me at Christmas, the quiet fixing of something broken before I ever noticed. But the night he sat across from me at the oak table, his hands trembling as they folded and unfolded the paper he had found, I knew this secret was nothing like those. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and when he finally looked at me, it was as though he had aged 10 years in a single evening. "There's something I never told you," he whispered, his voice cracking on the edges of the words. "Something about Oliver, about our family. I should have said it years ago, but I thought I was protecting you." My chest tightened. The air in the room grew heavier. Outside, wind pressed against the windows, rattling them like bones, and the lamp above us flickered. I tried to steady my voice, though my hands were already shaking. "What are you talking about, Henry? What do you mean about Oliver?" He pressed the paper flat on the table, but his eyes weren't on it. They were on me, filled with shame. "Ellie," he said, his breath trembling, "Oliver isn't the boy you think he is, and part of that is my fault." My pulse pounded in my ears, so loud I barely heard the clock ticking on the wall. I leaned closer, desperate and afraid at once. "Don't circle around it. Tell me." And then the truth slipped out in fragments, each word a knife. Years ago, before Samuel was born, Henry had made a mistake. He had been away for work, lonely, weak, and he had an affair. He swore it was brief, a single lapse, but the woman came back months later with a baby in her arms. Oliver. My throat closed, my breath stilled, the world around me tilted as though the floor had fallen away. "I took him in," Henry continued, his voice breaking. "I raised him as ours because I couldn't bear to let him be abandoned. I thought love would be enough. I thought if I gave him everything, he would never feel the difference. His eyes glistened, and he whispered, "But maybe he always knew. Maybe that's why he looks at us the way he does." I gripped the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood. My mind raced back through the years. Oliver's quietness, his distance, his bitterness when Samuel laughed too freely, his questions about money and inheritance. Every moment I had chalked up to temperament now blazed with a new and terrifying light. My son, the boy I had carried, nurtured, kissed goodnight, wasn't truly mine. The betrayal of Henry's confession cut deep, but the thought that Oliver had always known he was different, always resented the life Samuel and I shared with Henry, that shattered me. I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice cracked under the weight of grief. Henry's shoulders slumped. "Because I thought it didn't matter. You raised him as your own. You loved him like a mother. I thought we could bury the past. But now I see it surfacing in ways I can't control." Tears burned my eyes. Memories rushed back. Oliver's cold stares when Samuel hugged me, the way he flinched when I praised his brother, the sharp questions about the will. Had every one of those moments been his silent revenge for a truth we had hidden from him? I wanted to scream, to collapse, to erase the years and start again, but all I could do was sit there, clutching the edge of the table, while my heart cracked open. The room seemed to close in on me. I heard Samuel's laughter from upstairs, muffled by the ceiling, innocent and unknowing. A sob tore from my throat. How could I look him in the eye, knowing his brother might see him not as family, but as a rival who had stolen what could never truly be his? Henry reached for my hand, his own shaking. "I'm sorry, Ellie. I thought I was doing the right thing. But Oliver, he's slipping away. I see it in his eyes. He's not just angry anymore. He's planning something." His words trembled like a prophecy, and I felt ice spread through my veins. That night I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory of Oliver. The time he sat in the corner during Samuel's birthday party, refusing to sing, the way he clenched his jaw when Henry praised Samuel for helping in the shop. The time I found him rifling through the study, my mind twisted each memory into something darker. My heart ached with grief for a truth I never asked for, and fear for what it might mean for the future. The next morning, I tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. I brewed coffee, buttered toast, smiled when Samuel cracked a joke. But when Oliver entered the room, his eyes flicked to mine, sharp and knowing. For a moment, I wondered if he had overheard Henry's confession, if he could read the shame in my face. He smirked faintly, the corner of his mouth curling as though he carried a secret of his own. My stomach nodded. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of Henry's revelation pressed down harder. I wanted to confront Oliver, to demand the truth. Did he know? Did he resent us? But every time I tried, my voice failed. Instead, I watched him from the corner of my eye, searching for signs. The way he lingered near Clara, whispering. The way his eyes lingered on Samuel with something more venomous than simple sibling rivalry. One evening, when I could no longer bear the silence, I asked Henry, "What if he already knows?" Henry Sepp's face went pale. He swallowed hard. "If he does, then we are in more danger than I thought." And as much as I wanted to believe my husband was exaggerating, the dread inside me whispered otherwise. Because when I looked at Oliver now, I no longer saw my son. I saw a man with a plan, a man with secrets of his own, a man whose heart carried a wound that might never heal, a wound sharp enough to cut us all. And deep down I knew the truth Henry had revealed was not just a secret from the past, it was the spark of something that could destroy our future. When Oliver invited us on that trip, everything inside me twisted with unease. His voice was smooth, almost too warm, when he said, "You and Dad deserve a break. A family outing will do us all good before I settle into married life." He suggested a hike through the cliffs, just outside town, a place Henry and I had visited once when the boys were small. The memory should have brought comfort. The rolling hills, the sound of rushing water, the crisp air. But instead, the moment the words left his lips, my stomach tightened like a fist. I glanced at Henry, and though he smiled faintly, his eyes told me he felt it too. Something about the invitation wasn't right. Still, how could we refuse? To say no would be to admit we didn't trust him, to lay bare the fear we carried like a sickness in our bones. So we agreed. And the following weekend we found ourselves walking the narrow path of the cliffs with Oliver and Clara leading the way, their hands entwined like conspirators. Samuel was supposed to come, but Oliver had insisted it should just be us. Quality time, he'd called it. That detail alone should have screamed danger, but I pushed the thought down, telling myself I was paranoid. The air was sharp that day, carrying the scent of pine and damp stone. My boots crunched against gravel, and each step seemed to echo louder than the last. The cliffs loomed higher as we climbed, jagged edges cutting into the sky. Oliver strode ahead with confidence, Clara at his side, while Henry and I trailed behind, exchanging nervous glances. My husband's hand brushed mine, a silent tether keeping me from unraveling. At first, Oliver spoke of trivial things: the weather, the new house he and Clara were considering, plans for the future. But beneath his calm tone, I sensed an edge, a rehearsed quality, as though every word had been chosen carefully. Clara added little, only laughing softly now and then, her eyes darting back to us with a gleam I couldn't place. As we reached a clearing near the cliff's edge, Oliver stopped. He turned to face us, his expression unreadable, the wind whipping strands of hair across his forehead. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" he said, his voice low. His eyes scanned the horizon, then flicked back to us, sharp and piercing. I forced a nod, though my throat was tight. Henry muttered something about the view, but his hand found my arm, gripping it just a little too hard. He felt it too, the danger humming in the air. Then Oliver stepped closer. His voice dropped, calm but laced with something chilling. "Yusep had your time, Mom. Dad. All those years, all those decisions, but things are changing now. Clara and Yusep are ready to take over." The words sliced through me like a blade. My chest tightened, my pulse thundering. "Take over?" I repeated, my voice trembling. He smiled faintly, a smile that held no warmth. "The house, the accounts, the legacy. Yusep done enough. It's our turn." Henry Sip's face hardened, his voice rising with anger. "We are not dead yet, Oliver." But Oliver only tilted his head, his eyes glinting. "Not yet." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rush of wind against the rocks. My knees weakened, and I gripped Henry's arm, terror clawing at my throat. I searched my son's face, desperate for some flicker of love, some sign this was all a cruel joke. But all I saw was resolve, cold, unshakable resolve. And then he moved. Too quickly for me to process, Oliver lunged toward Henry, shoving him backward toward the cliff's edge. I screamed, the sound tearing from my lungs as Henry stumbled, his boots scraping against loose gravel. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought he would fall. He clutched at a jutting rock, his fingers bleeding as they gripped desperately. I lunged forward, clawing at Oliver's arm, begging him to stop, but Clara grabbed me from behind, her nails digging into my shoulders as she hissed, "Stay out of it." The world spun in chaos. The smell of blood filled the air, sharp and metallic, as Henry's hands slipped. I scrambled forward, grabbing his wrist just as he lost his grip. My body strained, every muscle screaming, as I fought to keep him from plummeting. Oliver loomed above us, his shadow falling over mine, his eyes empty. He whispered, almost tenderly, "Just let go, Mom. It'll be easier." My heart shattered. I couldn't recognize the boy I had raised, the boy I had once rocked to sleep. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but it carried death. Henry Sepp's face twisted with pain, his voice ragged as he gasped, "Don't let him win, Ellie." Time fractured. My mind raced with memories, Oliver's first steps, his quiet childhood stares, Samuel's laughter filling our home. How had we come to this? How had love twisted into this moment on the edge of a cliff? Somehow, by sheer will, I pulled Henry back onto solid ground. We collapsed together, gasping, our bodies shaking. Oliver's expression faltered, his jaw tightening with rage. Clara's grip on my shoulders loosened, and for a split second I broke free. But before we could rise, before we could flee, Oliver stepped closer, his boots grinding against the rocks. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice sharp, commanding. Henry tried to push himself up, but Oliver's foot pressed against his chest, pinning him. My scream echoed across the cliffs, swallowed by the vast emptiness around us. The weight of betrayal crushed me. The son I had loved, the son I had raised, was standing over us like an executioner. I wanted to fight, to claw, to scream until the heavens split open, but Henry's hand found mine, squeezing weakly. His lips brushed my ear, a whisper so faint I barely caught it. "Don't move, don't fight, pretend." His voice broke, but I understood. Pretend, pretend, to be beaten, pretend, to be broken, pretend, to be dead. My body froze. I let my head fall against the ground, forced my chest to rise and fall shallowly. Beside me, Henry stilled too, his breaths ragged but quieting. The wind howled over us, carrying away the sound of my racing heartbeat. Oliver stood above us, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning our faces. For a long, terrifying moment, I thought he would lean down and check for a pulse, that he would see through our charade. But instead, he stepped back, his voice low, as he muttered to Clara, "It's done." My blood ran cold. Done. As if we were already gone. As if the parents who had raised him were nothing more than obstacles removed. I lay there, unmoving, my tears sliding silently into the dirt, praying he wouldn't see them glisten. The sound of their footsteps retreating echoed against the cliffs, fading into the distance. Each step away brought a flicker of hope, but also the looming terror of what would come next. Because though Oliver believed we were finished, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far darker. The world seemed impossibly still after their footsteps vanished into the trees, as if the cliffs themselves were holding their breath. My body ached, every muscle trembling from the strain of dragging Henry back from the edge, but I dared not move until I was sure Oliver and Clara were truly gone. My heart hammered so violently I feared it would give us away. Finally, when silence stretched too long to be coincidence, Henry squeezed my hand, his whisper ragged, "They're gone, Ellie, they're gone." I opened my eyes, blinking against the sun, and pulled myself upright. Henry was pale, his shirt torn and streaked with blood from where his hands had scraped the rock. His chest rose and fell heavily, but he was alive, and that was enough. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched his face, my voice breaking, "We're alive. They thought they killed us, but we're still here." He nodded weakly, his lips trembling, but his eyes, oh, his eyes burned with something fierce. Not defeat, not despair, but a quiet, unshakable resolve. The climb back down was agony. Each step felt like a battle, every sound in the woods threatening to be Oliver's return. I held Henry's arm as we stumbled along the path, our bodies bruised but fueled by sheer will. When we reached the base of the cliffs, the sight of other hikers in the distance filled me with such relief that I nearly collapsed. A woman's voice called out, alarmed at our state, and within moments strangers surrounded us, their hands steadying our trembling bodies. We told them we had been attacked, that we needed help. I couldn't bring myself to say it was our own son, not yet. Saying it aloud would make it too real. By the time the police arrived, Henry's breathing was shallow, and I feared he would faint. I clung to him as we gave our statements, my voice shaking as I described the fall, the struggle, the betrayal. The officers' faces shifted from shock to grim understanding, and though I saw doubt flicker in their eyes when I revealed Oliver's name, they listened. They promised protection, promised justice. I wanted to believe them, but in the back of my mind I could still hear Oliver's voice, calm, certain, unrepentant. That night, lying in a hospital bed beside Henry, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Samuel came rushing in after the news reached him, his face stricken, his hands shaking as he touched my arm. "Mom, Dad, what happened? Tell me it isn't true." His eyes brimmed with tears, and in them I saw the innocence that had survived in him, untouched by greed or bitterness. I couldn't hide the truth anymore. With a breaking voice, I told him everything. Henry's secret about Oliver's parentage, the growing resentment, the documents, the cliff. Samuel's face crumpled as if the world itself had betrayed him. "He's my brother," he whispered. "How could he?" I had no answer. Days blurred into weeks as the investigation unfolded. Oliver and Clara were arrested after evidence surfaced. Clara's fingerprints on the documents Henry had found, Oliver's phone records placing him at the cliffs at the exact time of the attack, witness accounts of their suspicious behavior. When the trial began, I sat in the courtroom, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, and watched my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep, the boy I had kissed goodnight, stand on the other side, cold and unyielding. He did not look at me once, not when I testified through tears, not when Samuel begged him to explain, not even when Henry, his voice frail but steady, declared, "You are still my son, but you will answer for what you've done." The verdict came swiftly, guilty of attempted murder. Clara wept as the sentence was read, but Oliver's face remained stone. For a moment I thought he might turn his eyes toward me, offer some flicker of remorse, but he never did. He walked out of that courtroom in chains, his head high, as though he still believed he had been wronged. In the months that followed, our lives were a fragile patchwork of healing. Henry's wounds mended slowly, though the scars, both on his body and his soul, would never fade. Samuel stayed close, his laughter dimmer but still present, still carrying the warmth we clung to. Our home felt emptier, haunted by echoes of a son who had chosen darkness, but it was still ours. And in those quiet evenings when the house grew still, I would sit by the fire and let the truth wash over me. Family is not always bound by blood, nor is it always protected by love. Sometimes, the ones you give everything to are the very ones who try to take it all away. And yet amid the ruin, there was survival. There was Henry's hand in mine, Samuel's steadfast loyalty, the breath still rising in my chest each morning. We had been broken, yes, but we had not been destroyed. That in itself was a kind of victory. I often replay the moment at the wedding when Henry whispered those 5 words in my ear. "He doesn't love you anymore." At the time they shattered me. Now I see them for what they were, not just a warning, but a truth I had to face. Love cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. And when it curdles into resentment, it becomes a weapon sharper than any knife. If there is a lesson I carry from all of this, it is one I will whisper into Samuel's ear for as long as I live. Cherish those who show you love freely, who give without calculation, who laugh without envy. Hold them close, because the world is full of others who will see your heart as something to exploit. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies wear the faces of those we once rocked to sleep. Sometimes, betrayal comes not from strangers, but from the very blood we thought would protect us. But survival too can come from where you least expect it, in whispered warnings, in unshakable love, in the strength to keep breathing, even when the ones you loved most have tried to take that breath away. And so I live on, scarred but standing, carrying both grief and gratitude in equal measure, for though my heart is forever broken by Oliver's choices, it still beats. It beats for Henry. It beats for Samuel. It beats for the truth that even in the ashes of betrayal, love can still be found. And it is that love, not the betrayal, that will define me in the end.